Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane, and it's the morning of Monday, 22nd of July, 2019. And it's the first day of the school holidays, and it's also the first day of the parliamentary recess. So, Parliament rose last week and doesn't actually return to Westminster now until the 5th of September. And in fact, Parliament only returns for literally 7 days before it breaks up again until October the 5th. So just think about that for a second, because that means that we have a new Prime Minister sometime in the next few days. And that new Prime Minister then has to assemble his government and his team of Brexit negotiators. And so, in reality, Parliament is actually sitting for just 4 weeks, a total of 4 weeks, between now and when Britain is supposed to exit the EU on the 31st of October. So, call it a hunch, but the bottom line is that the establishment is going to be kicking the can down the road, and we will go beyond October the 31st, because the EU and the British establishment believe that the British people are so dumbed down, they are so apathetic, they really couldn't give a flying frack about whether or not we stay or leave the EU, and they can just keep kicking the can down the road, and there'll be debate in the media, but nobody's actually going to do anything about it. So pretty much coming up to the acid test here as to whether or not the British people are genuinely determined to leave the EU, or are just determined to keep talking about it. So when Parliament rises, of course, then this is an extremely good day to bury stuff that you don't really want much media attention for. And you certainly would prefer that only a minority of people actually know that something is being put into the public domain, because there's a requirement by a government to put stuff in the public domain, but there's no requirement for them to flag it up and give it any undue attention. And of course, the quote, "a good day to bury bad news," comes from the somewhat inept Joe Moore, who was the advisor to Stephen Byers, who I believe was the Transport Secretary back in 2001. And as news of the unfolding events in New York came through on 9/11, then Joe Moore famously said, "This is a good day to bury bad news." Well, Friday of last week was that day. And any time that basically government has stuff that it wants to conceal from the wider public, it'll put it out on the last day before a recess. So, funnily enough, now, of course, people are looking for what they are trying to sneak out without anybody seeing. And this time, there's probably other stuff, but the one thing that got my attention was the government announcing a consultation. And this is a consultation on water conservation. The full title is Water Conservation Measures to Reduce Personal Water Usage. Now, there is something that is rather contradictory about this, and that is that the government still apparently has an agenda to frack unconventional hydrocarbons out of the geology. And of course, this is a process that literally needs millions of gallons of water. Yes, I know Quadrilla has said that if they get permission to frack the second well, they're going to use a new recipe, a much thicker frack fluid, which they have to pump under much less pressure and consuming much less water. But it is still many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of gallons of water. And this is just one well, remember. So this is, a real contradiction, that on one hand, they want to have a consultation on measures to reduce personal usage, and on another, they still want to be seen to be promoting an industry that is literally going to not only suck reservoirs dry, but also contaminate those reservoirs, or contaminate certainly the aquifers, and also the soil, which of course groundwater runs through to get into the aquifers. So let's just have a look at some of the proposition here, because the proposal is that to acknowledge that the average person consumes 141 litres of water per day. And the consultation is to look to set at water usage targets by 2050. So yet another reason to then allege that humanity is the enemy of itself, and therefore it has to be taxed. So we're already being taxed on with the carbon taxes. Soon it's going to be a taxation on breathing out, and now a taxation, and a bigger taxation on consuming water. Meanwhile, of course, billions of gallons of water are seeping out through the Victorian distribution system, and very little reinvestment is going into refurbishing the distribution system, primarily because of greed. And that is that the CEOs of these companies are paying themselves outrageous sums of money. So what isn't disappearing in terms of salaries and benefits of the leadership teams? Oh, something kicking in there. But not only is the money leaching in terms of salaries and benefits of the leadership team, but then it's disappearing mostly overseas to the overseas owners. And of course, China is a massive owner of UK water. Surprise, surprise. So, this is a total contradiction. This is mismanagement. It's malfeasance of public office. Privatize everything, basically let the infrastructure fall apart. Meanwhile, the greedy management leech the profits, paying themselves outrageous salaries, and then dividends being paid offshore. And just to put an idea into your head, or thought into your head, as to how outrageously contradictory this is. First of all, I gather that water bills have risen by more than 40% above inflation since 1989, basically since privatisation. And the former regulator of Ofwat, which is part of DEFRA, the company or the government department that has commissioned this consultation on water usage, but a previous regulator, Johnson Cox, spoke out against the excessive levels of executive pay amongst the water companies. But this was considered to be somewhat hypocritical and disingenuous, seeing as Johnson Cox received £9.5 million from Anglian Water before joining Ofwat when he was the CEO of Anglian Water. So, this is a consultation that absolutely people need to get a response in. Of course, the government doesn't even want you to know that this consultation is taking place. The first the British government wants you to know that this consultation has taken place is when they publish the results and then say that there's an overwhelming majority of people who believe that, yes, water should be limited, and that people should pay outrageous sums of money for any consumption above their personal usage. Meanwhile, the chemical companies like INEOS, who also, of course, want to be a lead in the unconventional gas industry, the reason being is because they want the product for themselves. They want it as a raw material. They don't want to be fracking to get the gas into the national grid. It's purely a resource for them. And Jim Ratcliffe believes that obviously if he can reduce his cost of materials, his cost of sales by getting cheap gas, then the fact that it destroys communities, the fact that it's going to contaminate water, soil, air, and lead to very significant negative health impacts in those areas is an irrelevance to a socio-psychopath, which of course you must be now if you want to be a CEO of any kind of private or public company. Because if you show any kind of empathy for humanity, if you show any weakness in your quest for outrageous profitability and outrageous personal financial reward, then basically you'll be bounced out, because you clearly do not have what it takes to be a CEO. And sadly, the days of corporations having any kind of social responsibility are long gone. I remember those days when, my early days, when the chief executive of the part of Schlumberger that I was working for at the time actually advocated getting into the schools, helping the schools out, sharing knowledge, sharing skills at the school's behest. And there wasn't nothing being forced upon them. And, when the local schools needed a little bit of cash injection for particular projects, then he was absolutely at the front offering a check, ready to help out. Anybody who does that today, of course, it eats into the bottom line, unless the bottom line can be, or the expenditure can be justified as adding something to that bottom line, whether immediately or in the not too distant future, then it would be absolutely frowned upon. So I'll put the link to this consultation under the video today. And, this is an extremely important consultation. You can see where this is going. 141 litres per person is the benchmark. And, we absolutely need to get the utilities back under national control. These are the resources of the people. And of course, it's thanks to the Thatcher Reagan years and the Alan Greenspan philosophy on economics, which of course can be traced right back to basically the rules of plantation ownership in the days of the early years of the US. And these are the attitudes that prevail today. Now, the reality is that at the moment, we have a bit more of a voice than the slaves on the plantation used to have. But that voice is only valid if it is getting heard. And at the moment, there are still the medium to get that voice heard, to get that counter view out there. But the corporatocracy is doing everything it possibly can to shut that down. And, my good friend Gemma O'Doherty had her YouTube channels shut down again last week. And, of course, this is by Google, who own YouTube, in Ireland, where they have their headquarters. And this is the corporatocracy applying censorship. So right now, basically, it's Google, which of course owns YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. These three corporate entities are effectively deciding what can and what cannot be discussed on social media. And, whereas once upon a time, the view was that I might not agree with you with what you say, but I will do everything in my power to continue to ensure that you have the right to say it. And of course, that no longer applies. It seems that basically there is a list of topics, a prescribed view that you have to take if you want to continue to use these platforms. And, it is already evident that we are self-censoring, that in a bid to try and keep these platforms in place, we are unwittingly self-censoring. And yet, basically, we are effectively contradicting ourselves by not necessarily telling the whole truth, because we know that if we told the whole truth, then effectively the platforms would disappear. So we need new platforms. So maybe it's going to be a good thing, because today's the day that YouTube's terms and conditions change. So maybe, out of the problems of an existing established platform suddenly starting to curtail the way in which it can be used, maybe new platforms will emerge. And of course, in the ideal situation, new platforms will emerge that are outside of the control of the corporatocracy, at least until such time as those platforms are eventually bought out by the likes of Google, Facebook, or Twitter. And sadly, YouTube started with the idea that it would be effectively a town hall space where people could say pretty much anything they wanted to say, without fear of it getting taken down, regardless of how outrageous it was. But of course, Google came along, found the price that the founders of YouTube would accept, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I offer my full support to Gemma and all of those other patriots who are now outside of the Google offices demanding that Google and of course its subsidiary YouTube stop their outrageous censorship of those who are literally making observation and comment counter to that offered by the lamestream media. Well, of course, here we are in the summer again, and it's the July madness, and country's basically leaderless at the moment. Although the expectation is, of course, that if you're going to believe the media, that Boris is the shoe-in into number 10. He's already started ordering the furniture. I think it's about 4 years ago now since I made the observation on Humanity versus Insanity that there was the very real prospect that in the next few years we would have Trump in the White House and Boris in number 10, and it certainly seems that that is going to play out. Well, Boris, of course, in his previous role as Foreign Secretary, his only real reference to Iran was a misplaced comment about the lady who was arrested in Iran for spying, and Boris Johnson made the observation that she wasn't spying, she was a journalist, and teaching people in Iran how to be journalists. Yes, right. Well, we all know what the word journalist means when applied by the state. Well, obviously he walks in, assuming he does go into number 10, but he walks in to the tanker crisis. And this, of course, has been manipulated by John Bolton. And even lamestream commentators are now acknowledging the outrageous, hawkish behaviour of John Bolton and the fact that John Bolton is determined to initiate and ignite World War III. And it does seem that somehow John Bolton managed to influence the leaderless players in the UK and persuade the UK to board illegally an Iranian tanker. And if Britain or anyone else for 1 minute thought that Iran wouldn't retaliate, then you can only ask, on what planet are they watching this all unfold? So, John Bolton, people need to be aware that this man, if that's the right term, believes that he was put on Earth to initiate global conflict. This man represents everything that humanity doesn't stand for. He wants war, he wants conflict, and of course, you'll never see him in the front line or any one of his family, because, that's not the way sociopaths work, is it? So Bolton, if you don't know anything about John Bolton, then maybe take a little bit of time over the summer to do some research about this entity. Because if the world is on the brink of conflict, then there is little doubt that John Bolton will have his signature all over it. And it seems that Bolton is very, very well protected. If you look at the roles he's had over the last couple of decades, he's got to have an album of photographs, probably provided by Jeffrey Epstein, but he's got to have a whole album of photographs of people in compromising positions, because I cannot believe that so many people will just fall into line with Bolton's quest for global conflict. So the smartest thing that Britain can do, of course, is acknowledge that it made a mistake. I know that doesn't sit very well in diplomatic circles, but sometimes it's necessary. Admit you made a mistake in boarding and kidnapping, effectively, the tanker and the crew that was bound for wherever it was bound for. I mean, it's allegedly Syria, or I believe that Iran has said it was going to Turkey. But anyway, wherever it was bound for, it was still an illegal boarding. And the fact that Iran retaliated, well, of course, Bolton, had an orgasmic moment when he heard that, because it's exactly what he wants. But, Iran is an astute political player, so don't underestimate the tiger that, might be just lying dormant at the moment, because if it's prodded too much, it's going to unleash way beyond what most people believe to be the case. And of course, the US loves all the fact that Iran can now be sanctioned on a broader basis, because it keeps Iranian oil off the market. And the US oil and gas industry is effectively funded by the Federal Reserve. I mean, it is a debt-producing industry. And, the Federal Reserve doesn't care how much debt it ramps up, because it can just eat it, basically. So the US, obviously, they just print the money to keep the unconventional hydrocarbons being produced. And if there is the prospect of export, then that's just a bit of a bonus. And, of course, if Iranian oil is taken out off the market, or the Straits of Hormuz become impassable, then who gets to benefit? None other than the Ponzi scheme known as the US fracking industry. So, look, the rabbit holes run deep. The world is not one-dimensional. People are walking away from the lamestream media, although the Mail and the Mail on Sunday circulation seems to be rising, but that's to the detriment of the other rags. And the fact that people are walking away from the mainstream media is indicative of the fact that they realise that they are actually better off getting their insight and information from elsewhere. So as we head up to the summer month of August, and Parliament in recess, schools out, colleges out, Extinction Rebellion faffing around, still trying to convince people that there's a climate emergency that they need to be willing to pay taxes upon, whilst missing the whole point of what's really going on. But do your own research. Take the time through the summer months to do some research. Look at the bigger picture, because what is unfolding is not pretty. I would love to say that, things are on a good trajectory, but they're not. And then, of course, we throw in the 5G agenda. And I have to say, I was really gratified to see this is the headline in the Totnes Times from this weekend. Protesters come out in force against 5G. And on page 3, radiation fears spark anti-5G day of action. And, the article opens by acknowledging that the mayor of Totnes, who is a Green councillor, but the mayor of Totnes is absolutely on board and is determined to ask the right questions of the industry. Now, on Wednesday, in Wednesday morning's broadcast, I'm going to be sharing with you an email that has been received from the Manchester Airports Group. Now, the local anti-5G campaign in Manchester had made contact with the management team of Manchester Airports Group, and Manchester Airports Group leadership team had agreed to a meeting which was due to take place next Friday between themselves, and they wanted to listen to the concerns raised by the 5G campaigners. But it seems that Vodafone or the government or Ofcom or somebody has got at the Manchester Airport Group, because they've basically said, actually, we have no responsibility whatsoever for health, safety and well-being when it comes to 5G. That is the responsibility of the telecoms companies and the government. So here we go, abdication from the corporatocracy. And we see this, not my problem. Well, it is your problem. And because it's our problem in a big way, it's your problem. And we're going to make sure you know it's your problem. So if you want to hear the transcript of that email from Manchester Airports Group's IT director, and the crass dismissal of concerns about 5G microwave radiation, then join me at 8:30 on Wednesday morning. Meanwhile, you have a great day, and if you have any time today, then please do take a look at this consultation on personal water usage. A consultation that the British government and the water companies do not want you to know anything about. You have a great day, and I'll see you on Wednesday morning.